This is a CBS News Special Report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Washington. The final chapter in the impeachment of President Donald Trump is about to be written. 134 days after the House impeachment inquiry was announced, the Senate will vote on whether to remove him from office. This is only the third such vote in our history. 2/3, or 67 of the 100 senators, would need to vote yes for President Trump to be removed from office. Now, barring a last-minute surprise, that's not going to happen. The vote is expected to go largely along party lines. But there is one bombshell. Earlier today, we learned Republican Mitt Romney said he will vote yes on removal. And he spoke just a short time ago on the Senate floor.
My faith is at the heart of who I am. I take an oath before God as enormously consequential. I knew from the outset that being tasked with judging the president, the leader of my own party, would be the most difficult decision I have ever faced. I was not wrong.
And another late decision. We've just learned that West Virginia Democrat Joe Manchin will vote to remove the president, as will Red State Democrat Doug Jones of Alabama. Republican Susan Collins of Maine told us yesterday she will vote no. Now, senators are considering 2 articles of impeachment, abuse of power, and obstruction of Congress. Want to bring in now Nancy Cordes, who is on Capitol Hill. And Nancy, to hear Senator Romney say that Trump's actions were, quote, as egregious an assault on the Constitution as can be made. A stunningly tough rebuke of the president.
That's right, Norah, and he went on to say that he worried that he would be rebuked by history if he didn't vote to convict. Instead, he's going to settle for the rebuke of his party because there is now a great deal of anger that the president will not be able to claim universal victory among Republicans. He will lose one Republican, and it appears he will not gain any Democratic support because in addition to Manchin and Jones, as you mentioned, Norah, we are now hearing that Kyrsten Sinema, senator from Arizona, a Democrat, has told the Arizona Republic that she, too, is going to vote guilty on both counts. So Democrats stand united, and it appears that this will be a 52-48 vote on both articles of impeachment.
All right, Nancy Cordes, stand by. I want to bring in Major Garrett, who is at the White House, and the president had hoped for a bipartisan vote for acquittal. In fact, what he ended up with is a bipartisan vote to convict.
Very narrowly bipartisan vote to convict, but it is a big disappointment for this White House, Norah. For weeks now, the White House has been saying, hey, watch a couple of these Senate Democrats. They're probably going to break the president's way. House managers simply did not make the case, and because the Trump support is so strong in those states like West Virginia, the White House kept saying, we're probably going to get a bipartisan majority to not convict this president, and that will be its own kind of victory, quite separate from acquittal, which is the biggest issue of all. So these developments, a disappointment here at the White House, but the main issue, president is not going to be removed from office. That's an anticlimactic conclusion that was never in doubt, but the White House would have preferred to see some Democrats side with the White House.
All right, Major, thank you. Want to bring in our panel. John Dickerson is our senior political analyst and 60 Minutes correspondent. Margaret Brennan is the moderator of Face the Nation. CBS News political analyst Reince Priebus, who was President Trump's first chief of staff, and CBS News political contributor Joel Payne, a Democratic strategist. Welcome to all. John, you heard the Senate Majority Leader talk about the role of the United States Senate is essentially a way to protect against the temporary rage of causing permanent damage. Does this have an effect on the presidency?
Yes. Now, different sides will tell you what the effect is. He went all the way back to Hamilton and Jefferson. I think we're going to listen to the Majority Leader now.
The clerk will now read the first article of impeachment.
Article 1, Abuse of Power. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives, quote, shall have the sole power of impeachment, unquote, and that the President, quote, shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, close quote. In his conduct of the office of President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in that, using the powers of his office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his re-election, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit. In doing so, President Trump used the powers of the presidency in a manner that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the United States democratic process. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct through the following means. 1. President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into A, political opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., and B, a discredited theory promoted by Russia alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election. 2, with the same corrupt motives, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within the outside of the United States government, conditioned 2 official acts on the public announcements that he had requested. A, the release of $391 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated on a bipartisan basis for the purpose of providing vital military and security assistance to Ukraine to oppose Russian aggression, and which President Trump had ordered suspended. And B, a head of state meeting at the White House, which the president of Ukraine sought to demonstrate continued United States support for the government of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. 3, faced with the public revelation of his actions, President Trump ultimately released the military and security assistance to the government of Ukraine and has persisted in openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections. In all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He has also betrayed the nation by abusing his high office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place and vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment provides that no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. The question is on the first article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Not guilty.
Mr. Alexander, not guilty. Ms. Baldwin.
Guilty.
Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso.
Not guilty.
Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett.
Guilty.
Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal.
Guilty.
Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt.
Not guilty.
Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker.
Guilty.
Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun.
Not guilty.
Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, not guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, not guilty. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton.
Not guilty.
Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris, guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Jones.
Guilty.
Mr. Jones, guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kennedy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King.
Guilty.
Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler. Mrs. Loeffler, not guilty. Mr. Manchin.
Guilty.
Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey.
Guilty.
Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. McConnell.
Not guilty.
Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally, not guilty. Mr. Menendez.
Guilty.
Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley.
Guilty.
Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran.
Not guilty.
Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, not guilty. Mr. Murphy.
Guilty.
Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Paul.
Not guilty.
Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Perdue.
Not
Mr. Perdue, not guilty. Mr. Peters.
guilty.
Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, not guilty. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, not guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, not guilty. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young.
Not guilty.
Mr. Young, not guilty.
Article 1, 52 senators have voted not guilty, 48 guilty, which is the entire Democratic group of senators, along with one Republican senator, Mitt Romney. There is now going to be a second vote on Article 2, which is obstruction of Congress. Reince Priebus, the president's former chief of staff, is with us, and even though the president will be acquitted today and will remain in office, hearing them say guilty, it's still a stunning moment in our history.
Well, look, I think the Democrats started something they knew they couldn't finish. And there was never going to be a time when 20 Republicans were going to convict a president of something that we've talked a lot about, the articles that they didn't meet the threshold, and they weren't going to go for it.
Senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment. The clerk will read the second article of impeachment.
Article 2, obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. in his conduct of the office of the President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committee's undertaking the investigation serves subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. 1, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. 2, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. 3, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael McMulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Kristen Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of an impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of the constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
The question is on the second article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mrs. Blackburn.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blunt? Not guilty. Mr. Booker? Guilty. Mr. Bozeman? Not guilty. Mr. Braun? Not guilty. Mr. Brown? Guilty. Mr. Burr? Not guilty. Ms. Cantwell? Guilty. Mrs. Capito? Not guilty. Mr. Cardin? Guilty. Mr. Carper? Guilty. Mr. Casey? Guilty. Mr. Cassidy? Not guilty. Ms. Collins? Not guilty. Mr. Coons? Guilty. Mr. Cornyn? Not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto? Guilty. Mr. Cotton? Not guilty. Mr. Kramer? Not guilty. Mr. Crapo? Not guilty. Mr. Cruz? Not guilty. Mr. Daines? Not guilty. Ms. Duckworth? Guilty. Mr. Durbin? Guilty. Mr. Enzi? Not guilty. Ms. Ernst? Not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein? Guilty. Mrs. Fisher? Not guilty. Mr. Gardner? Not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand? Guilty. Mr. Graham? Not guilty. Mr. Grassley? Not guilty. Ms. Harris? Guilty. Ms. Hassan? Guilty. Mr. Hawley? Not guilty. Mr. Heinrich? Guilty. Ms. Hirono? Guilty. Mr. Hoven? Not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Inhofe? Not guilty. Mr. Johnson?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Jones? Guilty. Mr. Kane? Guilty. Mr. Kennedy?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. King? Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar? Guilty. Mr. Lankford? Not guilty. Mr. Leahy? Guilty. Mr. Lee?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler? Not guilty. Mr. Manchin? Guilty. Mr. Markey? Guilty. Mr. McConnell? Not guilty. Ms. McSally? Not guilty. Mr. Menendez? Guilty. Mr. Merkley? Guilty. Mr. Moran? Not guilty. Ms. Murkowski? Not guilty. Mr. Murphy? Guilty. Mrs. Murray? Guilty. Mr. Paul?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Perdue? Not guilty. Mr. Peters? Guilty. Mr. Portman? Not guilty. Mr. Reed? Guilty. Mr. Risch? Not guilty. Mr. Roberts? Not guilty. Mr. Romney? Not guilty. Ms. Rosen? Guilty. Mr. Rounds? Not guilty. Mr. Rubio? Not guilty. Mr. Sanders? Guilty. Mr. Sass? Not guilty. Mr. Schatz. Guilty. Mr. Schumer. Guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Guilty. Mr. Shelby. Not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Guilty. Ms. Smith. Guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Guilty. Mr. Sullivan.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Tester. Guilty. Mr. Thune. Not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Not guilty. Mr. Udall. Guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Guilty. Mr. Warner. Guilty. Ms. Warren. Guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Guilty. Mr. Wicker. Not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Guilty. Mr. Young. Not guilty.
The President of the United States will remain in office as senators have voted in the majority to hold the president not guilty on Articles 1 and 2 in the articles of impeachment passed by a Democratic House of Representatives, largely along party lines, except for one exception. Republican Senator Mitt Romney of Utah, who voted with Democrats on Article 1, which is abuse of power, where he voted
this
guilty.
article of impeachment, 47 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 53 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that respondent Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, President of the United States, upon 2 articles of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charges contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby, acquitted of the charges in said articles.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
I send an order to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State, as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Before this process fully concludes, I want to very quickly acknowledge a few of the people who helped the Senate fulfill our duty these past weeks. First and foremost, I know my colleagues join me in thanking Chief Justice Roberts for presiding over the Senate trial with a clear head, steady hand, and the forbearance that this rare occasion demands. We know full well that his presence as our presiding officer came in addition to, not instead of, his day job across the street. So the Senate thanks the Chief Justice and his staff who helped him perform this unique role. Like his predecessor, Chief Justice Rehnquist, the Senate will be awarding Chief Justice Roberts the Golden Gavel to commemorate his time presiding over this body. We typically award this to new senators after about 100 hours in the chair, but I think we can agree the Chief Justice has put in his due and then some. Page is delivering the gavel.
Thank you very much.
Of course, there are countless Senate professionals whose efforts were essential. I'll have more thorough thanks to offer next week to all of those teams, from the Secretary of the Senate's office to the parliamentarians, to the Sergeant-at-Arms team, and beyond. But there are two more groups I'd like to single out now. First, the two different classes of Senate pages who participated in this trial. Their footwork and cool under pressure literally kept the floor running. Our current class came on board right in the middle of the third presidential impeachment trial in American history and quickly found themselves hand-delivering 180 question cards from senators' desks to the dais. No pressure, right, guys? So thank you all very much for your good work. And second, the fine men and women of the Capitol Police, we know that the safety of our democracy literally rests in their hands every single day. But the heightened measures surrounding the trial meant even more hours and even more work and even more vigilance. Thank you all very much for your service to this body and to the country.
The chair recognizes the Democratic leader.
I join the Republican leader in thanking the personnel who aided the Senate over the past several weeks. Capitol Police do an outstanding job day in, day out to protect the members of this chamber, their staffs, the press, and everyone who works in and visits this Capitol. They were asked to work extra shifts and in greater numbers to provide additional security over the past 3 weeks. Thank you to every one of them. I, too, would like to thank those wonderful pages. I so much enjoyed you with your serious faces walking down right here and giving the Chief Justice our questions. As the leader noted, the new class of pages started midway in this impeachment trial. When you take a new job, you're usually given a few days to take stock of things, get up to speed. This class was given no such leeway, but they stepped right in, didn't miss a beat, ferrying hundreds of questions from U.S. senators to the Chief Justice on national television is not how most of us spend our first week at work, but they did it with aplomb. I'd also like to extend my personal thank you to David Houck, the Director of the Office of Accessibility Services, Tyler Pumphrey, the Supervisor, and Grace Ridgway, the wonderful Director of Capitol Facilities. Everyone Grace's team worked so hard to make sure we were ready for impeachment. Gary Richardson, known affectionately to us as Tiny, the chief chamber attendant. Jim Hoover and the cabinet shop, who built new cabinets to deprive us of the use of our electronics and flip phones during the trial. Brenda Bird and her team did a spectacular job of keeping the Capitol clean, and Lyden Webb and his team who moved the furniture and then moved it again and again and again. Grace, we appreciate all your hard work. Please convey our sincerest thanks to your staff. Thank you all, the whole staff, for your diligent work through many long days and late nights during this very trying time in our nation's history.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The chair also wishes to make a very brief statement. I would like to begin by thanking the Majority Leader and the Democratic Leader for their support as I attempted to carry out ill-defined responsibilities in an unfamiliar setting. They ensured that I had the wise counsel of the Senate itself through its secretary and her legislative staff. I am especially grateful to the parliamentarian and her deputy for their unfailing patience and keen insight. I am likewise grateful to the Sergeant-at-Arms and his staff for the assistance and many courtesies that they extended during my period of required residency. And thank you all for making my presence here as comfortable as possible. As I depart the chamber, I do so with an invitation to visit the court. By long tradition and in memory of the 135 years we sat in this building, we keep the front row of the gallery in our courtroom open for members of Congress who might want to drop by to see an argument or to escape one. I also depart with sincere good wishes as we carry out our common commitment to the Constitution through the distinct roles assigned to us by that charter. You have been generous hosts, and I look forward to seeing you again under happier circumstances. The Chair recognizes the Majority Leader.
I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the articles against Donald John Trump, adjourn, sine die.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned, sine die.